Thank you very much. So, uh, without further ado, this is the tallest monument of its kind anywhere in Scotland, standing over 6.5 meters, 21 feet high. It features powerful scenes of battle, execution, and ritual. Part 3 of BBC series Pilgrimage, first broadcast on the 25th of April 2022. According to the narrator, it's thought to be a Christian Pictish monument carved between the 9th and 10th centuries. The helpful thing here is the observation that this stone is Christian, above all because it must provide clarity about what is the front and what is the back. It's worth establishing at the outset that the giant cross visible here is the front. To all intents and purposes, it is a very expensive and unmistakably Christian war memorial with a very specific propaganda purpose. In my view, this section is the raison d'etre for the whole monument. Here's a photo I took a couple of months ago, but this artist's impression is clearer. In his book, The Symbol Stones of Scotland, Anthony Jackson wrote that the two tall figures could be Saints Andrew and Columba, and this is a royal inauguration of what looks like a child or youth. However, the object of their blessing appears to have been deliberately erased. In an excellent 1993 paper, Sueno Stone and Its Interpreters, David Seller drew attention to the affinity between this 13th century image and the one on Sueno's stone. So you can see that this is the seal of the Abbey of Scone, the inauguration of the King of Scots, and that's from around 1250. Seller took the stylistic similarities here as good supporting evidence for the idea that the Sueno stone image is indeed a royal inauguration of some kind. I agree, but if that's correct, I think it also suggests that the iconography hasn't had a chance to evolve very much. In other words, if one was trying to assign the correct age to Sueno stone, this is evidence that it's later rather than earlier. Charles McKean was a dear family friend and noted Edinburgh aficionado who touched on Sueno's stone in this 1987 book about Murray. He said, the name Sueno's stone derives from Boyce's supposition that it recorded Sueno's victory over Malcolm II in 1008, but the style is earlier and may instead commemorate a victory of the Picts over the Danes. Taking the second part of the sentence first, Pictish authorship has a great deal of support, but not everyone is convinced. This is Adrian Maldonado, whose book Crucible of Nations, Scotland from Viking Age to Medieval Kingdom was published in 2021. There are certain motifs which have been argued to be late in the series of Pictish sculpture in parallel with better dated examples outside Scotland. The 7-metre high Sueno stone, Forres, has been placed in several possible historical contexts, ranging anywhere from the mid-9th century to the start of the 11th. So the stone in Forres, Sueno stone, it's been placed in several possible historical contexts ranging from the mid-9th to the start of the 11th. And looking then at the first part of Charles's sentence, the name Sueno stone derives from Boyce's supposition that it recorded Sueno's victory over Malcolm II in 1008. I'd love to be able to talk at length about Hector Boyce, but let's quickly get to grips with the name of the monument. This would be a convenient solution to all our problems. Sueno is Sweyn Forkbeard, a Viking empire builder, briefly King of England from 1013 to 14 for about 5 weeks, and father of Canute, whose reign was 1016 to 1035. I should make clear I don't think the monument has any direct connection to this Great Dane, though I tend to think his association has a long pedigree and it may be a kind of very cryptic clue. but it's worth reminding ourselves of the apparent youthfulness of the defaced central figure. Anne Tornishty, this is the Irish Deputy PM and former Taoiseach Michael Martin, aged 17. I won't try to pronounce it correctly, but here he is again. Tornishty and Fianna Fáil party leader Michael Martin. Tornishty, have sort of tried to that bit, I've tried to pronounce it the way it says it's supposed to be, but I'm probably wrong anyway, but derives from Gaelic Tanis Rig, king in waiting. That's the bit I don't know how to pronounce. This term Tanis Rig, meaning king in waiting or heir apparent, was in use in Scotland and Ireland in the early Middle Ages. I think this combination of images brings out the propaganda dimension I was talking about. It's official messaging aimed at Murray's sometimes recalcitrant ruling elite. According to Professor Megan Gondek, medieval stone monuments were statements of power. I think what you see here is very much a statement of power intended to burnish the credentials of a newly designated heir to the throne. This is one of 3 new information boards put up next to the stone only a few months ago. Some errors that marred the old info panels have been corrected, and in many ways this is an improvement, though there are still a few problems. This paragraph is significant. Carbon dating reveals, it says, carbon dating reveals construction on the site around the late 800s, a period that saw conflict with Vikings and a shift from Pictish rule in eastern Scotland to the new Gaelic kingdom of Alba. Archaeologists have found carbon traces in the soil in what are identified as post holes next to the monument. These holes are likely to date from when a derrick or scaffold was used to put the stone in place. The researchers got a scattering of carbon dates, including a cluster indicating the mid to late 9th century. As I'll try to explain, however, I think it's peculiar to try to draw conclusions from this. I'd invite you to imagine one of Edinburgh's Victorian monuments, and the one I'm thinking of is Greyfriars Bobby. Let's say it was actually a bit bigger than the real one, so it needed scaffolding when it was erected in 1873. Well, supposing a few hundred years from now its origins had been forgotten. It seems plausible to me that someone might look at the name Greyfriars Bobby and think it was linked to the Franciscans, the Grey Friars, and their community in Edinburgh in the Middle Ages. Therefore, assuming for argument's sake that the science of carbon dating is not very different from what we have now, they could investigate the soil in the immediate vicinity of the monument, focusing their attention on post holes. But the question I'd like to ask is, would the dates they came up with necessarily tell them anything very much about the age of the statue? Surely they could expect a wide range of dates, but as I say, nothing it would be sensible to hang firm conclusions on. This talk by Professor Jane Geddes is due to take place very shortly in London. It promises to be very illuminating. But I don't entirely agree with this from the outline on the Society of Antiquaries website. Although named since the 17th century as Sueno's stone after the 11th century Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark, recent carbon dating by Gordon Noble places its erection in the later 9th century. And this is a forthcoming article in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, reconsidering the Forest Cross Sueno stone. This article was co-authored by Professor Gordon Noble and 2 others, and it presents the findings of the investigation of the post holes with the carbon dates. This, however, is extracted from an email I received from one of these co-authors. On carbon dating, it's definitely a blunt instrument and useless for pinning down exact dates when things happened. The few carbon dates from material gathered from around Sueno stone cover a huge range, from the 7th to the 12th century. So I think that is a useful thing to bear in mind. The few carbon dates from material around Sueno stone cover a huge range from the 7th to the 12th century. Now, I should say I don't wish to get this person into trouble, but I can't help sharing it with you because it just isn't legitimate to use the data from that investigation to rule out a later date for Sueno stone. And here's where I have an equally serious gripe with the new information boards. I'll just read here. Was the stone coloured? Our illustration at left, which you can't see, but and we will have a look at that in a minute, but it shows Sueno stone partly painted using colours available in Scotland in the 800s. We don't know what colours were used or even that the stone was painted at all, but colourful manuscripts of the same period suggest it may have been. At right, a page from the Book of Kells, produced in Scotland around AD 800, shows the range of colours available. It says, so produced in Scotland around AD 800. This arises from a narrow focus on the scriptoria on Iona, and notably at the monastery of Port Mahomac on the Tarbat Peninsula, which was excavated in recent decades. Worth reading here is the small print, Trinity College Library, Dublin. Now, the Book of Kells, as I'm sure many of you know, is on display in Dublin, where it is acclaimed as a high watermark of Irish artistic achievement. This passage from St. Adovnan's Life of Columba, written in the 7th century, is relevant. And so he says, for these islands of the sea, Scotia, Ireland, and Britain, have twice been ravaged by a dreadful pestilence throughout their whole extent, except among the two tribes, the Picts and Scots of Britain. Now, to what other person can this favour granted them by God be attributed, unless to St. Columba, whose monasteries lie within the territories of both these people, and have been regarded by both with the greatest respect up to the present time? In reality, the correct location of the production of the Book of Kells simply isn't knowable. It could be modern-day Scotland or modern-day Ireland, or it could have been started in one and finished in the other. Regardless, though, it originates in a Columban milieu, which is essentially Irish, not Scottish. A bland statement like this is therefore highly misleading, not to say downright spurious. On a more positive note, however, here's another snippet from the synopsis of Professor Geddes' talk. The military engagement on the east face includes over 80 warriors, at least 16 beheaded. Signs of horse and possibly dog sacrifice indicate Viking funerary practice. Thanks to John Borland's excellent drawings, the new information boards bring this out very well. So we have sacrificial steeds. Two scenes seem to depict horses being sacrificed. There are records of this practice at some Viking funerals. And here's an image of the alleged dog sacrifice, not something to bring up in a discussion of Greyfriars Bobby, perhaps. Meanwhile, though, representing a lesser sin of omission from the new info panels, in my view, is the absence of any mention of Trajan's column. So Trajan's column, completed under the supervision of Apollodorus of Damascus in AD 113. Dr. Louisa Izzy delivered a great paper on the connection between this monument and Sueno stone to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in Edinburgh in 2013. The column tells the story of Emperor Trajan's victories in the Dacian Wars in what is now Romania. Recalling Professor Gondek's phrase, this monument is a statement of power par excellence. It is 38.4 meters or 126 feet from the ground to the statue base, and it has a spiral staircase inside it. Another notable feature is the number of severed heads. You might expect this aspect to make a particular impression on anyone who, over the course of their working life, had encountered the same sort of grisly spectacle. And here we have early 11th century artwork whose debt to Trajan's column is unambiguous. From the text you can see below and right the Christus Schaule Christ column, also known as St. Bernvard's column, Hildesheim, from around 1020. The detail is Herod presented with the head of St. John the Baptist. And even more famous from the 11th century, of course, though without any severed heads on this section, the Bayeux Tapestry. Emeritus Professor Howard B. Clark of University College Dublin identified an ecclesiastic called Abbot Scotland as the Bayeux Tapestry's project mastermind, based partly on a visit Scotland made to Rome in around 1073. Both these important artifacts have thus been shown to have been directly inspired by Trajan's column. Among Scottish monarchs, only one is known to have made a pilgrimage to Rome. I don't know if anyone knows who that is. It is Macbeth. Well done. Staying with the 11th century, this is Dr. Maldonado again, in his capacity as a scholar at National Museum Scotland. The 11th century seems to lack a coherent archaeological footprint. This is despite the major changes that are known from the historical record. The Battle of Carham in 1018 effectively ended Northumbrian control beyond the Tweed, where the border sits today. Across Britain and Ireland, seismic dynastic shifts were occurring in the 11th century. The death of Macbethad mac Finlech, known to most as Macbeth, and the establishment of the dynasty of Malcolm III. Danish and later Norman rule in England, the Battle of Clontarf in AD 1014 and its aftermath in Ireland. During these disruptions, the traditional power centres and religious sites of Scotland seem to be in flux. For those of you who don't know of it, the Battle of Clontarf, highlighted here, was a momentous and very bloody battle fought in Dublin in 1014. An army that was mostly native Irish and some Vikings defeated an army of mostly Vikings and some native Irish. And another key event mentioned here is the Battle of Carham in 1018. So here we have a map with Edinburgh and Carham down here on the River Tweed, on the border on the River Tweed. Part of my case for Carham's importance would rest on this 2006 quote from Alex Wolff. He said in an interview with the BBC in 2006, it was the battle which secured Scottish rule of the land south of the Forth and made sure that what we now think of as the core territory of Scotland, Glasgow, Edinburgh in the central belt, became Scottish. Without Carham, there would be no Scotland. You have to bear in mind that once the dust had settled, not only Lothian, but also the whole of Strathclyde and Galloway came under Scottish control. Many of you may be aware of this frieze in Edinburgh Castle. We have Malcolm II, whose reign is 1005 to 1034, Duncan I, 1034 to 1040, and Macbeth, 1040 to 1057. So Malcolm's reign was obviously a very long one, nearly 30 years from 1005 to 1034. I think he deserves to be called Malcolm the Great, not least for his feats of arms against marauding Scandinavians, but that's outside the scope of my talk this evening. However, from the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, he has an entry that was written by Professor Dovit Brune of Glasgow University. Malcolm II, Malcolm mac Cinetha, died in 1034, King of Scots, was the son of Kenneth II, who died in 995. His mother was possibly a daughter of a king of Leinster. Having challenged his cousin Kenneth III for the kingship and killed him at the Battle of Moniverde in Strathearn, now Perthshire, in 1005, he reigned for nearly 30 years, and at his death he was described by a contemporary annalist as the honour of all the west of Europe. Malcolm was known to medieval chroniclers as the most victorious. His martial record was, however, patchy. There's a particular episode in Malcolm's relations with the English which Dovit Brune and other historians can cite to justify such a lukewarm appraisal of his abilities as a war leader. The Siege of Durham in 1006, an article by Bernard Meehan, which appeared in the Scottish Historical Review in April 1976. I'll just read the text. During the reign of Ethelred II, that's Ethelred the Unready, and the Episcopate of Eldon, Malcolm II, King of Scots, the son of King Kenneth, attacked Durham. Earl Waltheof, too old to counter Malcolm, took refuge in Bamborough. His son Uchtred, whose wife Edgefrida was the daughter of Bishop Eldon, raised an army and heavily defeated the Scots, whose heads were displayed around the walls of Durham. This costly escapade showcased a concept known in the Gaelic-speaking world as a crech rig, meaning a royal hunt or prey. It was a way for a new leader to establish his tough guy credentials by raiding into a neighbour's territory. Now, valuable contemporary evidence is found sub anno, so it says SA sub anno under the year 1006 in the Annals of Ulster, a battle between the men of Alba and the Saxons, and the Scots were defeated and a great number of their nobles left dead. And we also have an important 12th century source called the De Obsessione Dunelmi, which is on the Siege of Durham by somebody called Simeon of Durham. And he tells how Uchtred had the heads of the slain made more presentable with their hair combed, as was then the custom, and taken to Durham, there washed by 4 women and fixed on stakes round the walls. They gave the women who had washed them a cow each as payment. Here, though, was the return fixture. A great battle was fought at Carham between the Scots and the English, between Uchtred, son of Waltheof, Earl of Northumbria, and Malcolm II, King of the Scots. With him was Owen the Bald, King of the men of Strathclyde. That's another text written by Simeon of Durham called the Historia Regum, and that's from about 1130. Simeon of Durham is our most important, though not our only source for this battle. So in yet another text, Libellus de Exordio, which is about the history of the church in Durham, he wrote, "In the year of our Lord 1018, while Canute was ruling the kingdom of the English, there appeared to the Northumbrian peoples a comet, which persisted for 30 nights, presaging in a terrible way the future devastation of the province. For soon afterwards, that is, after 30 days, the whole people between the river Tees and the river Tweed fought a battle at Carham against a countless multitude of Scots, and almost all perished, including even their old folk. When the bishop heard of the miserable death of the people of St. Cuthbert, he was stricken with deep sorrow of heart, and sighed, saying, 'Oh, why, wretched as I am, was I spared to see these times?'" And returning to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, it is not known whether Malcolm had any sons, but he may have had as many as 3 daughters. The only one whose name is known is Bethoc, who married Crinan, abbot of Dunkeld, who died in 1045. Their son was Duncan I, who succeeded Malcolm as king. Another daughter of Malcolm married Sigurd Hlodvison, Earl of Orkney, who's also called Sigurd the Stout, whose son was Thorfinn the Mighty, Earl of Orkney. The evidence for Malcolm's 3rd daughter is late and uncertain. She is alleged to have married Findlech mac Ruadri, King of Murray, whose son Macbeth, who died in 1057, succeeded Duncan as King of Scots in 1040. It's worth noting that Macbeth's father is described here as a King of Murray. Elsewhere he's called a mormaer, which is more like an earl. Forres is then thought to have been a significant seat of power in Murray. Another thing to take away from this is that Duncan and Macbeth may both have been Malcolm's grandsons and therefore first cousins. But I'd also like to highlight this. Another daughter of Malcolm II married Sigurd Hlodvison, Sigurd the Stout, Earl of Orkney, who died in 1014. Uh, he was killed at the Battle of Clontarf, in fact. And I think we can discern from this that Malcolm's abilities as a warlord were tied to his diplomatic acumen. Assuming, as I do, that Simeon of Durham isn't prone to wild exaggeration, I think this description of a countless multitude of Scots suggests Malcolm's army was swelled by Norse allies from Orkney and elsewhere. You would therefore have had a certain number of Danes on the English Northumbrian side and Norse on the Scottish side, echoing the situation at Clontarf, where Scandinavians fought on both sides. So I think that's one logical way to account for Viking burials with horse sacrifices. In the aftermath of the Battle of Carham, Norse warriors from Orkney and elsewhere may have accorded Viking funeral rites to Danes, as well as their own people, who they identified among the dead. My view then that Carham was a truly epic confrontation aligns with Simeon of Durham's commentary, but it isn't fashionable, and it depends to some extent on my belief in the relevance of this late 18th century report. Linton is an almost disappeared village near Moorbattle in Roxburghshire, about 7 miles south of Carham. And so from the old statistical account in 1792, we find there is the following information. In repairing the church lately, there was found a large grave containing 50 skulls, all equally decayed, some of them cut with the stroke of violence, belonging, it is supposed, to persons slain in some border fight, of which there were many in this neighbourhood. In the summer, arriving in early September, I made a pilgrimage largely on foot from Linton Moorbattle to Forres. As you can see from this, once I got there, I was privileged to be allowed into Sueno Stone's glass and steel protective case. I did the walk partly as an awareness and fundraising effort for Argyll-based school feeding charity Mary's Meals, but I also hope that in writing it up, I can provide a comprehensive account of the Linton battlefield scenario. Returning briefly though to this family portrait, as far as the succession is concerned, this is a very helpful quote from Nick Aitchison's 1999 book about Macbeth. The significance of Duncan's accession is that he was the first king of Scots to have succeeded in a direct line, a radical departure from the traditional system. But before trying to tie it directly to Sueno's stone, there are a few other things to address. One of two other sections of the current information hoarding, a royal Christian monument. So here we have a caption, "In good faith, the shaft and background of this huge cross are carpeted with two interlaced designs." The intricacy of the interlace on this cross is one of the monument's most striking features. My photo on the right won't win any prizes, but it conveys a sense perhaps of the amount of work involved. And then we have this, not wishing to overlook the sides. So the caption here is, "Bearing fruit, the sides of the stone are decorated with vine scroll inhabited by human figures, and on the north side, mermen." Vine scroll appears widely in Christian art, symbolizing the wine taken during Mass. Vine scroll is certainly not unknown on early medieval Scottish monuments, but it's more commonly found in Northumbria. And so we have the Ruthwell Cross. It's 5.5 meters tall, about 18 feet, housed inside Ruthwell Kirk, Dumfriesshire, but Anglo-Saxon, a smashing apotheosis of the flowering of Northumbrian culture in the 7th to 8th centuries. I've used that word smashing for a reason. Sadly, the Ruthwell Cross was smashed to pieces by 17th century iconoclasts, but we can be grateful that much of it was reassembled in the more sedate 19th century. The section on the right gives some idea of why art historians are so smitten with this monument. Christ proclaiming the word of God, with St. Mary Magdalene anointing his feet. And what you can see on this side is beautifully wrought vine scroll. It actually has a pretty clear stylistic affinity with the vine scroll on Sueno stone, hinting at the possibility of direct influence. Having said that, however, the two main reasons for positing an influence are more prosaic. They are firstly timing. If the stone was commissioned, as I suggest, by Malcolm II, as a Trajan's column-like commemoration of the Battle of Carham, he would only recently have found himself in possession of the church of Ruthwell and its fabled cross. Therefore, height, a defining feature of Sueno stone, is the other important reason to suppose an influence. So the Ruthwell cross is 5.5 meters, and this gives you an approximate idea of how Sueno's stone measures up at 6.5 meters. And then I'd like to turn the spotlight onto the Carew cross, not as big, but still an impressive object, 4 meters high. The Carew cross in Pembrokeshire in southwest Wales, 4 meters, about 13 feet tall, in two parts, joined by a mortice and tenon. Its Latin inscription identifies it as a memorial to Maredudd ab Edwin of Deheubarth, who died in 1035, commissioned by his brother Hywel, who died in 1044. My contention here is that scholars acknowledge the 11th century provenance of the Carew cross only because it has this inscription, putting the question beyond doubt. If there was no inscription, I suspect there'd be quite a lot of resistance to the idea that it could be so late. And now, here is Sueno stone's east face, or in other words, the back of the monument. It's war reportage, exactly like Trajan's column, albeit on a smaller scale. More or less in the geometric centre of this face is a truncated cone shape, which is a key to understanding the whole monument. These three dividing lines suggest 4 distinct narrative sections, though the topmost scene is quite badly worn away by the elements. In any case, however, its right-facing cavalry give an impression of being decorative, so I think we can start here. A digital scan of the top part of that middle section. This, I believe, is Malcolm II at the beginning of his reign, ready and raring to embark on his inaugural Crech-Rig raid into enemy territory, which in his case meant an attack on Durham. I also think that's a kilt he's wearing, by the way, though it's a brave historian who would say so unreservedly. Moving down to the next scene, local Murray author Leslie Southwick interpreted this as a fight between two champions of opposing armies. Only these two figures are armed, and the one on the right appears to have put his sword through the head of the one on the left. The army behind this poor unfortunate is running away. They've turned in the other direction. I believe this could have been a preliminary face-off between the invading Scots and the Northumbrians. It wasn't unusual for belligerents to put up champions to engage in single combat, either as an alternative to full-scale confrontation or as a prelude to it. And now we come to perhaps the most arresting scene on the monument. Its macabre imagery was chosen by Historic Environment Scotland to encapsulate the whole shooting match. The time has come to turn our gaze to the famous or infamous cone shape. Here's part of what the New Information Board says. Heat of battle. This feature has been variously interpreted as a broch, tower, or bell. I hope you'll forgive me for dispensing with the idea that it's a bell. There just isn't enough contextual support for it. But to quote John Borland in an online presentation of his from the autumn of 2021, Warriors and War of Pictish Sculpture, we have this tower or broch-like feature in the centre of the stone. an impressive digital reconstruction of a broch, built all over the Highlands and Islands, of course, between about 200 BC and 200 AD. Returning to John Borland, though, he said, we're really too late for it to be a broch. And then he makes a suggestion: a round tower for a church. And that's what I think it is. I think this is the western tower of Durham's so-called Great Church, which was pulled down at the end of the 11th century. To anyone who says it's out of proportion, I'm tempted to proffer this, though I'm not suggesting the stone's creators necessarily knew everything there is to know about perspective. But you can see here that to this day, Durham is really symbolised by the central crossing tower of the Norman cathedral, which also incidentally slopes upwards slightly. I think the earlier tower served the same purpose. One reason we know it was tall is that it took several years longer to build than the rest of the church. I'd also look to Orkney again. Sometime after Durham Cathedral was completed in 1133, its Anglo-Norman stonemasons are known to have gone to work on St Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall, Orkney. The conical tower of St Magnus's Church on Egglesea, built around the same time, has stumped architectural historians. So master builders associated with Durham were building church towers with sloping sides. And this stained glass window that happens is in St Andrews, and it also has the church tower in Egglesea. But to the left of that, quoting John Borland again, we have a line of dead bodies without heads. Their heads have been severed. That row has 6 of them, in fact, and highlighted here is a 7th, whose head appears to have been removed by this important-looking individual who holds it in front of him. The action has overlapped onto the scene below, where Uchtred the Bold enters the fray amid great fanfare. There are 3 trumpeters behind him. Uchtred the Bold, heir to the earldom of, or rather the elderdom of Bamborough. For his defeat of Malcolm's army, a grateful Ethelred II the Unready made him Ealdorman or Earl of Northumbria. Uchtred is supposedly Bernard Cornwell's ancestor, on whom he based this character, Uchtred of Bebbanburg, in The Last Kingdom, which I'm afraid I've never seen. But what I think you see here, meanwhile, are 2 pairs of fighters who represent the raising of the siege. Then at this point, I think our attention is drawn back up to this row of 6 headless corpses, which we should now see as illustrative of the aftermath of Uchtred's defeat of the Scots besiegers. So we're not finished with the truncated cone shape. Here's the full text from the new information panel. And so it says, or it might represent a furnace used to melt down the weapons of the defeated army. I don't think it has anything to do with melting down weapons. Again, because that interpretation doesn't take account of the context, or doesn't take adequate account of the context. There's this pile of 6 severed heads occupying the space immediately below it. But I do think furnace is correct. Credit must go to archaeometallurgist Dr. Tim Young of Cardiff University for pointing out in 2023 the resemblance of this object to a tar furnace or kiln. Thanks also to Fiona Campbell-Howes for reporting it on her blog, and to Cormac Burke for making the furnace idea a line of Fiona CH's inquiries. Tar can be seen flowing out of the base of the furnace or kiln onto the disembodied heads. This was a familiar process in the Middle Ages and right into the 17th century, preparing severed heads for long-term public display. Surviving tar furnaces are rare, but this 19th century example is near Pilsen in the Czech Republic. And here is the comparison. The first person we know of whose severed head was coated in tar for the purpose of putting it on a stake was actually, does anyone know? It was William Wallace in 1305. So I believe this is compelling evidence that the procedure is much older. Thus, the cone shape serves two purposes: as the besieged western tower of Durham's great church, and as a furnace or kiln producing tar for preserving the severed heads which were the gruesome consequence of that siege. On this panel, at left, we see a posse of mounted Scots flees amid a hail of arrows from the Northumbrian lines. The sorry tale of Malcolm's Creich rig is brought to a close, but he lived to fight another day. Then a section which is already familiar, a relatively concise single-frame tableau. Most observers agree this is some kind of field tent or canopy, underneath which is another post-battle reckoning. With this pale turquoise hue for some reason, these are more headless bodies, and these, I'm afraid, are yet more severed heads. I reckon this is the Battle of Carham. If the stone dates to the 1020s, it would still have been quite fresh in many people's memories, and therefore wouldn't have needed extensive coverage. But I should clarify that even highly specialised historians tend to be cagey about Carham. Here's Neil McGuigan in the book he edited with Alex Wolff in 2018 to mark the 1000th anniversary. The Battle of Carham, unfortunately, is not mentioned in John of Worcester's Chronicon ex Chronicis, nor indeed in any surviving recension of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The strong implication here is that Carham's absence from these sources must mean it wasn't such a major event after all. However, another text from 2018. The oldest manuscript of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which recounts important events year by year, has a short entry for 1066, the most famous year in English history. It starts, "Here King Edward died, and Earl Harold succeeded to the kingdom and held it 40 weeks and 1 day. And here William came and won England." The chronicler also noted the appearance of a comet in April 1066. But this manuscript of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle contains no mention of the Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October 1066. And this is the actual entry for 1066 in the oldest version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So it's perfectly true. The Battle of Carham doesn't get a mention, but a generation or so later, the authors of the same chronicle were hardly enthusiastic about acknowledging the Battle of Hastings. Now, what we see here above, the Jelling stones in Denmark, and to the right, a colorized replica of the larger of the two Jelling stones, Denmark's baptismal certificate, commissioned by Harold Bluetooth in about 970 AD. Based on an analogy with his unification of Denmark and Norway, Harold Bluetooth gives his name to the short-range wireless technology which connects fixed and mobile communication devices, and he was almost certainly Sweyn Forkbeard's father, by the way. The acclaim of this stone as Denmark's baptismal certificate is in virtue of the crucified Christ you can see there. So that's a very exalted label, which might lead us to ask if anything comparable can be said of Sueno's stone. I think that depends on who or what is depicted on this section. The inauguration scene again. I think it's Malcolm II's grandson, Duncan. In 2015, Duncan was played in a film version by David Thewlis, who wasn't quite as old as we usually expect. And the caption, it says, Malcolm II's Tannis Rig, King in Waiting, his grandson, Duncan. But even better, we might put Thewlis, the young teenager, here. So coming to the end, this is the 1960s era Ministry of Public Building and Works information panel. But this approximately is the wording I'd be inclined to use. This great monolith dates to around the late 20s of the 11th century. The massive cross, with its tightly regimented interlace ornamentation and laced crosshead, was intended to inspire awe. At its base is what has been interpreted as a royal inauguration. The other face has two immense battle scenes with ranks of horse and foot soldiers. Also prominent are rows of decapitated bodies and heaps of severed heads. Bearing comparison with the Bayeux tapestry, Sueno's stone tells the story of Malcolm II's feud with Earl Uchtred of Northumbria, recounting the siege of Durham in 1006 and culminating in the 1018 Battle of Carham. It was intended to apprise the people of Murray, including Macbeth, of Malcolm's appointment of his grandson Duncan as his Tanais Rig, king in waiting. Given Carham's exceptional long-term significance, the monument could therefore be called Scotland's birth certificate. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.